This might be a bit loud. Quite a bit too loud.
I'll turn down.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm assuming I probably don't need this, but. Okay. What's that?
Ci siamo.
Check, 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 check. You can all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, wonderful. What's that? Okay, well, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's an honor, and especially to kick off this conference. But I want to thank all of the organizers and all of you for being here. I'm looking forward to this very much. The last time I was at a similar conference was just after the first edition of this book came out, and it was in Liège with a lot of earth scientists as well as archaeologists, and at that point I realized there was a lot of data that I wasn't aware of in a parallel field, and that resulted in the revised edition of the book. So I suspect something similar will happen here. I'm not sure I'll be able to come up with a third edition of the book, but definitely I think there's so much information I've already learned in the last 2 days that I'm going to definitely have to revise things and Sardinia in much more than I have been already. So what I will do today, what I was asked to do, is tread a kind of a fine line. Some of what I'll do today is going to be very familiar to all of you. And you'll be like, yeah, why is he telling me this? I already know this. And for others, I think it'll be new because you're in an adjacent field. So bear with me. If it's something you've heard before, sit back and enjoy your coffee. And if you haven't heard it before, take copious notes and ask me questions afterward. But I've been asked to basically set the context. What is happening, not here, in the Western Mediterranean, but what is happening over in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean at approximately this time, the Late Bronze Age, and especially the end of the Late Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, so that we can then see how we should place Sardinia into the larger picture. So I will be mentioning Sardinia from time to time. I've worked a couple of questions in based on what I've already seen and heard the last 2 days. But for the most part, we will be several hundred miles away, but in the same time period. So without further ado, let me get started, and we'll happily answer all questions towards the end. So we've got, what did you say, 2 hours, 3 hours for me? Something like that? Yeah? Okay. I'll try to keep it to about 45 minutes, leaving some 15 minutes for Q&A before we've got coffee. So. All right, so let me take you back to the time period that I think most of us in this room would rather be living in. Back to the Late Bronze Age. Certainly if I were able to be reincarnated backwards, that's where I would like to live. I'm sure I'd be dead in about 48 hours, but it would be a lovely 48 hours. So I'll concentrate here on 1700 to 1200 BCE, and the period where what I call the G8 were ruling in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. So we've got Minoans and Mycenaeans over in Greece and Crete. We've got the Hittites, the ones in purple, up in Anatolia, modern day Turkey. Then we've got Assyrians and Babylonians, and Mitanni, for that matter, in Mesopotamia, basically North Syria and Iraq. Canaanites in Canaan, the Levant. We've got Egyptians in Egypt, Cypriots in Cyprus, and so on. So there's 8 or 9 of them, and when I'm talking to popular audiences, in order to try and make it relevant, I call it the G8 because they seem to understand that. So basically, for our purposes, what we're interested in is this is a time when the Mediterranean was globalized. That's a phrase that Sucher at Sheffield has used, and I think it's pretty appropriate. So we've got everybody interacting with everyone else, and I've got Babylonians on here, Aegeans on here, Assyrians, and so on. And it's epitomized by the hard evidence, the data that we've got for Late Bronze Age trade back then. And the Ullaburn shipwreck was featured in one of the museums that we were at yesterday, went down off the coast of Anatolia in about 1300 BCE, and you can see the National Geographic reconstructions of it, plus the map. But we've also got things like Egyptian wall paintings in the tombs of the nobles especially, where you've got Minoans and Mycenaeans bringing gifts to the pharaoh from the time of Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III, so 15th century BCE. We've also got written evidence. We've got Amarna letters, the Amarna archives in Egypt, got the Hittite archives up in Anatolia. We've got Mari over in Mesopotamia a little bit earlier, and of course Ugarit on the coast of what is now North Syria. So we've got a lot of written evidence as well as archaeological evidence for this period. My absolute favorite, you see the sandals in the lower left. There is a text at Mari from about 1800 BC in which it says that leather shoes in the style of Minoan workmanship, which means probably sandals, maybe boots, were taken to Babylon to King Hammurabi, but that he returned them. And I've always wondered why he returned them. Were they too small? Were they too last millennium? And hadn't he ever heard of gift giving? Right here, these are from Crete. They're too small for me, but you'll like them. Right? And actually, the 1177 book, that was the original title, was Hammurabi's Shoes. And Rob Tempio at Princeton said, lovely title, no. Like, why not? He says, nobody's going to understand it unless they read the book. I said, that's the whole point, right? He says, no, the whole point is to get them to pull it off the shelf and buy it before they've read it. So it became 1177. Anyway, we've got a lot of evidence then for trade, written and archaeological. As a result, we know that we're looking at what is called a small world network, if you do social network analysis. And this is something where if you've got a network, everyone in the network is connected to everyone else, either directly or indirectly, and nobody is more than 3 hops away from anybody else. So on this, you can see, for instance, the Mycenaeans on the left, they're connected to the Hittites, but they're not directly connected to the Assyrians. However, you can get to them through the Hittites or through the Egyptians, through the Babylonians, and so on. So a small world network is when everybody in the network is 3 hops or less from anybody else. We tend to do this in the United States with the game involving Kevin Bacon and the movies that he has been in, if anybody has done that. Right, so why does this matter? Because there haven't actually been that many times in the history of humanity that there have been these small world networks. Us today, obviously, the entire world is a small world network, but also back in the late Bronze Age, they would have formed that as well. And so I would say that what happened to them, even though it was 3,200 years ago, may be more relevant to us today, and that maybe we need to pay attention to what happened and to what they did and did not do. Now, the one thing about this is you will have just noticed that Sardinia was not listed in there. So I am wondering now if Sardinia should be considered to be part of that small world network in the globalized Mediterranean. And I am wondering if we've been underestimating the role and the extent of Sardinian participation in that commercial network. So it's been mentioned the last couple of days, and I've seen in the literature, Sardinian pottery is now beginning to be recognized. They have it at Hala Sultan Teki in Cyprus, they've got it at Komos on Crete. I'm wondering how many other Sardinian sherds or other items are lying just unrecognized in storerooms, in the boxes labeled unknown. And I remember at Komos, they had a box like that, and a number of Italian archaeologists came through and said, oh, that's Italian ware, that's Italian ware. They were able to identify it. So I'm wondering if we've got the same sort of thing here. I suspect that it is, and that we need to add Sardinia in, but the question is how to go about fixing the situation. I suspect also it would take sending out Sardinian archaeologists and specialists over to the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean to go through their stuff in the storerooms and say, yes, 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 that's nuragic, that's nuragic. But that's going to involve money and time. But I would suggest that's going to be one of the first steps, is the people from here go there and see what they can find. Now, the problem with the late Bronze Age is that it came to an end. All good things must come to an end, and it does as well. Round about 1200 BCE, most of you are familiar with some of the reasons for it. I'll walk through them as well, and then see if we can tie Sardinia into some of these. But this is where my book, 1177, came in, because Rob Tempio at Princeton back in, I think it was like 2007, he asked me if I could write a book on the collapse of the late Bronze Age. And I said, of course I can. There's about 20 people that could write it. And he's like, okay, good, so you'll do it. And I said, no. He was like, why not? I said, because I don't want to. He's like, you don't want to write a book on the collapse. Why not? I said, because you guys already did it. Robert Drews published a book back in 1992. It was a pretty good book. I didn't agree with his conclusions. He thought infantry ended everything. But I said, you guys have already done it. And he says, that was 92, now it's 2007, haven't things changed? And I said, yeah, there's a lot of data. He said, okay, good, so let's do it. I said, no. He's like, why not? I said, because I want to write about what collapsed, not why it collapsed or how it collapsed. And he's like, all right, let's make a deal. If you begin and end the book with why or how it might have collapsed, you can write about anything you want in the middle. And I'm like, great, we have a deal. And so that's why the middle of the book is all about Minoans, Mycenaeans, Hittites, Canaanites, and everything else. So, well, when I got to looking at the potential causes for this, I found that things had changed over time. Not surprisingly, back when I was an undergraduate, I was simply told it was the sea peoples that had done it. They were responsible for absolutely everything. Then things changed. As I went on to graduate school and such, I learned that other people had suggested maybe it was a drought, maybe it was famine, maybe it was invaders, maybe it was earthquakes. And so I weighed the pros and cons towards the end of the book, and I decided that the answer, if I had to choose one of these, the answer was yes. It was all of the above. It was a perfect storm. And in fact, at one point in the book, I call it a series of unfortunate events, which those of you with children will remember, or maybe you remember yourselves reading Lemony Snicket. That was one of his pet phrases. So, and I have to tell you, I do play a little game with my editors and publishers, trying to get phrases through kind of pop culture and see if they'll let it through. So, series of unfortunate events made it through. At one point I was talking about, I think, fighting with the Assyrians, and I said resistance was futile, and that made it through, and so any Star Trek people recognize that, and so on. So I decided that it was all of the above, and all of the data that's come out since about 2014, to my mind, corroborate that suggestion. And basically, it's very simple. If you get hit with an earthquake, for example, which is apparently not likely to happen here in Sardinia, but does happen elsewhere, the earthquake will hurt your society, but it won't wipe it out. It's not going to end it. Same thing with drought, famine, invaders. A lot of people will die, but it's usually not going to end your society. But what if you have more than one of these at once? What if you have two of them? What if you have three of them? And they don't have to happen at once. They can happen one after the other, so that you don't have time to recover from the one before the next one hits. And at some point, you're just going to throw up your hands and say enough. And that's when the collapse, I think, will start. Or if not a collapse, at least a major transformation. So I have changed slightly. If you've got the revised edition that came out in 2021, you will see that I come down much harder on the idea that climate change was the primary driver. It's not the only one, but I think that from the climate change we get the drought, from the drought we get the famine, from the famine we get the migrants and invaders and so on. But it's not totally linear. You all know that ancient history is much, much, much messier than that. So, but I do think that climate change is the primary stressor. So let me walk through some of these ideas and the evidence for them, get everybody on the same page. And again, I apologize to those of you for whom this is old knowledge, but hopefully For some, it will be new. And we start with the sea peoples themselves, near and dear to our heart here on Sardinia. They come to Egypt twice, 1207 and 1177. A better way of putting it is the 5th year of Merneptah and the 8th year of Ramses III. And actually, when Rob Tempio told me that the title of the book should be 1177, I said, no, the title should be the 8th year of Ramses III. And he said, that's more accurate, but it won't fit on the cover, which was true. And in fact, the originals, once he wouldn't take Hammurabi's shoes, the contract I signed was for a book called 1186. But as I was writing the book, I decided I liked Ken Kitchen's chronology better, and so it became 1177. So backstory to all of this. So, and this all comes down to Ramses III and his famous inscription on the wall of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, in which he tells us about the sea peoples coming across. I won't read you the whole thing, but he basically says that no land could stand before them, and he names their route basically, Hate, Kode, Karkamesh, Arzawa, Alashia. So we can see they're coming across, they're going up against the Hittites, Hatti. Kode and Karkamesh are basically where Turkey and Syria meet today. Arzawa, or Arzawa, is on the western coast of Anatolia. And Alashia, at least in my mind, is the Bronze Age name for Cyprus. So they're sweeping across, basically, across the Aegean and Anatolia, then down the coast of Canaan until they eventually come up against Egypt. And he actually names them, you can see down here, the name Sea Peoples is us. That's the French Egyptologists that coined that name, but the Egyptians actually tell us they are the Peleset, the Tjeker, the Sheklis, the Denyen, the Weshesh, and then there are others that are named as well, including the Shardana or the Shurdan. And he says that they came over and attacked Egypt, but that he beat them. So in year 12, he tells us, I overthrew those who invaded from their lands. I slew the Denyen, the Tjeker and the Peleset were made ashes. The Shardana and the Weshesh of the sea, they were made as those that exist not. And then he says, I bound them as captives to Egypt, like the sand of the shore. I settled them in strongholds bound in my name. So he says he settled them down in what was probably Egypt and Canaan at that time. And that was it. They never came again. They came twice, never came a third time. So, but we know all about these because he gives us pictures of them as well as writing about them. And so we've been playing linguistic games for more than a century at this point. And so this is where I have fun usually with my general audiences. I don't have to do it with you all, but I ask the audience, tell me some other place in the Mediterranean that sounds like Shardana with the same consonants. And eventually some bright person in the audience will go hesitantly, Sardinia? Like, yes, absolutely, right. And then same with the Shekelesh, and they come up with Sicily. Then the others they usually don't come up with, but the Tjeker could be the Sickles or the Troad. Denyen could be Homer's Danaans, perhaps, or maybe somewhere over in Anatolia. The Weshesh, maybe Willisah, Troy. I really like Nancy Sanders' description. She calls them the shadowy Weshesh, which is a good way to put it. The only one that we're absolutely sure that we know, and we might not even be right about that, but the Peleset being the Philistines. And this was suggested already back in the days of Champollion, right, the guy who deciphered hieroglyphics. So, as I say, we're playing linguistic games still, and none of these have been identified for sure, but we all have our favorites among them. So, for instance, here's one possible scenario, which I borrowed with your permission from Nurnet, right, where you've got the Shurdan coming here and everybody coming and ending up in Egypt. But the question is this the right direction? Perhaps they went the other direction after they got defeated. The one thing for sure is this is a migration at this time. It is a movement of people. Ramses III shows us that there are ox carts with women and children and Samsonite luggage, along with the warriors. So this is not an invasion, it is a migration. And there is a difference between the two. So I actually think a better comparison, people usually say, oh, it's like the Vikings. I'm like, no, it's nothing like the Vikings. It's more like the Dust Bowl in the 1930s in the US, where they're moving from Oklahoma to California because of a drought. Or it's like the recent Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war in Syria. I think that's what we should see the Sea Peoples as. And Asafio Landau, who I direct the excavations at Cabri with, he once said that the Sea Peoples were as much victims as they were oppressors. And I think that's probably a perfect way to put it. So while I do think they are part of this whole scenario, I do not think they were, as I was once taught, solely responsible for the collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age. They're part of it. But now we've got some new additional data. I just want to give you one example. At Ashkelon, a couple of years ago, they published the results of their excavations. They excavated an entire Philistine cemetery. The way they did it was rather interesting. I won't go into details here, but I can talk about it over the coffee break. But in addition to the Philistine cemetery, they also excavated underneath some of the houses in the cities, and they found a couple of intramural burials right underneath the floor. And they found a number of kids, infants, and they got the DNA from 4 of them. Now, the kids date, they're not Sea Peoples themselves, they date to sometime in the later 11th century, but they're probably like the grandkids, because the DNA showed, and I know genetics isn't quite like this, but they're basically 40% local Canaanite and 60% other. And when they ran the computer models, you can see I've highlighted there, the models suggested that the other was either Sardinia or Spain or Crete. One of the 3, those were the 3 most likely. In which case, it's kind of interesting because these are Philistines according to the pottery, and yet the genetics suggests that maybe they should be Sardana from Sardinia, if that's where they're coming from. Now, I'll be the first to admit, as did the people that ran this, 4 kids is too small a sample. We need a lot more. But this is some evidence that the Philistines and others came from overseas, in which case we can certainly look to this area. Now, so that brings me to my second question. The age-old question is, the Sardana and the Shurden of the Sea Peoples, do they come from Sardinia? Right? Or do they go to Sardinia after they were defeated by the Egyptians? Or, and Leanne and I were talking about this yesterday, is it both? Do they come from Sardinia, and then when they lose, they return here afterwards? So they're both coming and going, and that, I think, is a distinct possibility. Or are they completely unrelated to Sardinia? That one, I don't think that's the case. I think there is some connection with Sardinia. That's my personal belief. I can't prove it, but I definitely think that it's not a coincidence. So we'll leave it at that. But I do not know which way they are going. Are they coming from Sardinia, or are they coming here after they've lost, or is it both? So this is one of the questions I hope we will discuss during this workshop, along with a number of other things, because, as I say, there's currently no agreement. This may be the largest question about the Sea Peoples. Okay, I'm going to run through some of the others quickly. I've got an eye on the time here. Some of the ideas and evidence for drought, aka climate change, which we will be talking about here in terms of Sardinia, but let me present what was happening elsewhere at about the same time period. The idea of drought ending the late Bronze Age is not new. Rhys Carpenter, who taught at Bryn Mawr, had already put out this book in 1966, saying that drought ended the Mycenaean civilization. Now, he didn't have hard data for it. He was working off of settlement patterns, graves, and things like that. So he didn't have hard proof. And in fact, his idea was kind of lost along the way. There's a couple of books that refer back to it, but basically it not only dropped out of favor, just dropped out of sight. But it's now been resurrected because we now have the hard data that he was missing back then. And it's due in part to Kanievsky, working out of France, but also to some other groups as well. One of Kanievsky's first publications came out in 2011. I've got it circled there in red, the site of Gibala, modern Tel Twaini. And he and his team looked at the pollen that they were able to recover, and they said that the plants had changed and they were now adapted to a more arid climate, and that they saw evidence for a 300-year dry event. And I have to say, I love the jargon. Yes, a dry event. It's called a drought, right? And if it's 300 years, it's a mega drought. Right, we talk about a mega drought in California and Colorado now. That's only lasted like 10 or 15 years. Talk about 300. Now, it's not 300 everywhere. It might only be about 150, but that's still pretty long. So Kanievsky and his team did that at Twaini. Then they moved over to Cyprus, to Hala Sultan the same place that has now identified Sardinian nuragic pottery there. And they found the same thing, that there was a dry event from about 1200 down to 850, and that it became a much drier landscape. And then others took it up as well. We've got Daphne Langut, you can see her in the lower right there, working with Israel Finkelstein and Thomas Litt, and they went to the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, found the same thing, that there is a drought there, but not quite as long, from about 1250 to 1100. So they said there's climate change there too. Kanievsky came back, went to work off of Haifa and published in 2014, and saw that the sea level had changed as well. Plus, they had changed from a wooded area with trees and everything to a kind of thorny shrub steppe-like. So we've got lots of change there as well. And again, he said it doesn't begin to recover until the middle of the 9th century. So you've got a couple of centuries there. In the meantime, other people are working elsewhere. In Egypt, for example, in 2012, there was a study that was published showing that they also had drought there, which was a bit surprising. You would think the Nile would be okay throughout all this, but no. There was a lack of rain up in the Ethiopian plateau, and that affected the Nile. Another survey, let's see if I can, there we go, by Mark Macklin and everyone, same thing. They also found that in Egypt. That came out in 2015. And I have to say, this is where that conference I went to in 2014, where I first realized that all the earth scientists were doing this type of studying, and they were in parallel to us. And I hadn't been aware of this, and they hadn't followed our work. And so when I came out of that conference, I wrote to all these, to Mark and to Noel Roberts and all that. I said, send me everything you've published, see what you've got. And there was so much that I then went to Rob at Princeton. I said, we need a revised edition. I've left out 2/3 of the drought evidence. So, and it turns out it's pretty much everywhere in Greece. For example, Lee Drake pulled together a bunch of different studies, and then, of course, the very well-known study by Martin Finet and Erica Viberg looking at the stalagmite at Mavri Tripa, and you can see the stalagmite top left here, and then there are measurements bottom right, and in the purple, that's where the stalagmite stopped growing because there wasn't any water. I hope we've got something similar to talk about here in the next 2 days. So most recently, Stuart Manning published a study from Gordian showing that there was a drought, and that he was able to date it specifically to 1198 to 1196. That's pretty specific, but he has it from a number of different things. He used dendrochronology, he used radiocarbon, and they all kind of corroborated to do this. As opposed to Kanievsky, he had earlier tried to do it for Tel Twaini and got criticized for being too specific, but nobody's criticized Sturt, to my knowledge, about this, in part because Sturt was one of the ones that criticized Kanievsky, and then he comes back with very specific as well. So that's up then in Anatolia. And then also recently, Kristen Christensen pointed to northern Italy and said that there was a drought there. This work by other people, but he was publicizing it, dating to about 1200 BCE. And what caught my eye was that he said that led to a massive migration of up to 120,000 people who left at that time. And I thought, well, is that part of the Sea Peoples? Is this part of the beginning that they're moving out of northern Italy? And that's where it went from there. Well, if they're moving out of northern Italy, are they moving out of Sardinia and Sicily as well? So the upshot is, even though this is now slightly dated, this is Kanievsky's map from 2019, showing all of the sites where they've got scientific data where it says there was evidence for a drought back in this particular period. You can see it spreads all the way from northern Italy to Iran. And it's not just one source of data. It's from lagoons, it's from lakes, it's from caves, stalagmites. And so I personally think that this is conclusive. You can't question it. There is drought at that time. It may not be 150 or 300 years everywhere, but it is at least in some places. So I think we do have to take this into account, and that is why I'm now saying this is one of, or the major stressor at the time. So my question number 3 is such climate change affecting Sardinia at the end of the late Bronze Age? And if so, how can we determine that? And I am very hopeful that we will be getting data during this workshop from one or more of you, and I already heard some things as we were wandering around yesterday that would seem to imply that there was some sort of effect on Sardinia. So I hope we can talk about that. But the other question that I have is what caused the drought? It's one thing to say there's a drought, but what caused it? And this is where running around giving lectures on this can be rather interesting and intimidating, because I was giving a talk on this at NASA, and they said to me, so what caused the drought? And I said, I have no idea. And they said, then why are you talking to us? And I said, well, I hope that you're going to give me an idea. And they said, have you ever heard of a solar minimum? And I said, no, what's that? And they promptly sent me stuff to read about. And I'm like, okay, fine. So yes, it probably was a solar minimum. It leads to cooler temperatures out there, but what causes a solar minimum? And that is a big question that's still being answered. Some of the things that people have published is that perhaps it was caused by Mount Etna erupting in about 1300 BCE. Others have suggested that the Santorini volcano, which had originally blown up in 1600 BC, somewhere around there, and that is everybody's favorite reason for the drought at the end of the late Bronze Age, even though it had nothing to do with it. But when you're on the internet with all the people that think they know better, they're like, well, it was definitely Thera. I'm like, no, it was definitely not Thera. Right? 300-400 years too early. But there have been people that suggested that Thera may have had some smaller eruption, some smaller activity in about 1200. I've only seen that published in one article, and I'm not sure I believe it. But the other favorite is people saying, well, what about the Hekla 3 eruption up in Iceland? I'm like, sure, that could have contributed, but that's about 1100 or 1000 BC. So the collapse, the transformation at the end of the late Bronze Age would already have been underway. So I think this is still up for debate as to what would have caused the drought. One possibility is that it might have been what's known as a bond event. And when I first ran across this, I was very excited because I thought it was 007, it was Bond, James Bond. But no, it's a scientist named Gerard Bond. And he said that every approximately 1500 years, we get an increase in ice debris coming down further south, and that's going to cause a drop in ocean temperatures. So very similar is an RCC, a rapid climate change, which does pretty much the same thing. It's when the frigid polar air comes down further south. We've had a number of these in the States the last couple of years, and that everything then drops. Now, there have been about 6 of these rapid climate changes during the Holocene. One's associated with the Neolithic Revolution and all of that, and there's another one right around our particular period, though a little bit later. It's more like 1100 to 900 BCE. But people like Elko Rolling and Bernard Weininger have been studying these. So I think we've probably got something like that. But this is an area for investigation. All right, and then based on that, once you've got drought, you usually have famine hand in hand. But all of the archaeologists know it's very hard to identify famine on the archaeological record. Even if you've got like a major burial, it's hard to see it. But if you've got it written in texts, then it's pretty much incontrovertible. And in fact, from Ugarit, we've got, as I mentioned, some of the archives, 3 merchants' archives, and they are going to mention it along with others elsewhere. So I give you just a couple of examples to show that we know there's famine there. This is from Bania, a merchant sent to Ortenu in Ugarit. Ortenu was a merchant who was successful enough that he had a branch office in inland Syria, and Imar, and Bania is his representative there. And he writes back to Ortenu that there is a famine in Imar, and he says, we're all going to die of hunger if you don't quickly come here. We're going to die. You won't see a living soul. So I don't know about you, but I think this is pretty good evidence that there's famine in Imar, right? But we've also got letters from the Hittite king where he is saying that there's a famine in my land. It's a matter of life and death. They're writing especially down to the Egyptians, asking for grain. And then we've got a new letter. Well, it's a new old letter. The French found it and were sitting on it for quite a while, but finally published a translation in 2016 in French. And then my friend Yuri Cohen came out in English in 2021. And this letter found in Ugarit is from Pharaoh, Seti II, and he is quoting back to the king of Ugarit from a letter that had been sent from Ugarit. He says, you had written to me, in the land of Ugarit there is a severe hunger. May my Lord save the land of Ugarit. May the king give grain to save my life. So I think, again, pretty good evidence. You've got the king of Ugarit saying that there's a famine here. Please send grain. So Ugarit definitely has a famine as well. And then there are others that were published by the French in 2016 too. This one is from an official or a citizen, again saying there's no food in Ugarit. What can you do about it? All right. Now, I do think that some people were aware of what was going on. Israel Finkelstein and a couple of his colleagues have published evidence showing that the Egyptians in particular were crossbreeding their cattle at this time. And they were breeding them with zebu or zebu cattle, which are much better to survive in arid climates. They were also overplanting the lands they were controlling in Canaan with grain so that they could get more. And I think this goes hand in hand with the fact that the Egyptians do send relief ships up to the Hittites and elsewhere. And there is, in fact, in that letter from Seti, he sends a boatload of dried fish, 7,000 dried fish, and a bunch of textiles and beads. Not sure what the textiles and beads would do to help your hunger, but the 7,000 dried fish would certainly have come in handy. So I do think that some people were aware of what was going on and were taking steps to try and survive the drought and the famine. So that leads me to my fourth question is, do we have any similar evidence here? Is there any evidence for famine on Sardinia at the end of the Late Bronze Age? And if we don't have the texts that actually record that, which we don't, how would we go about determining that? So I'll be interested to see if anybody's got any evidence suggesting that there might have been a famine to go with climate change here on the island, if we've got a 1-2 system here as well. But I don't know that we're going to be able to answer this question today or anytime in the near future, but I hope that one of you will be able to say, yes, 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 here's what we've got, and we'll go from there. But we will see. As for invaders, I already read to you what Ramses III had said, but we've got evidence from elsewhere as well. Here's a letter from, this is the famous letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Cyprus, saying that ships have been spotted and that all of his troops are gone, and he's up helping the Luca and elsewhere. And please send me a report if you see any other ships. This has long been reported as having been found in a kiln, and it was being baked before being sent, but before it could be sent, the city was overrun. That turns out not to be the case in looking again at the archaeological data. Rather than in a kiln, it looks like this letter was in a basket up on the second story, and when the palace caught on fire, the basket fell, landed in the courtyard below upside down. The wicker of the basket disappeared, but it left the 70 tablets in a kiln-like shape. So we don't actually know whether this is from the time of Merneptah or Ramses III. We don't know if this is a copy. We don't know if it's the original that was never sent. So this is now a lot more ambiguous than we had thought. Fortunately, there are some new pieces to the puzzle that have been found. There's other tablets that were known, like this one that says there are 20 more boats in the region. And then I love this one. It's from the Hittite viceroy Carchemish, saying, you need to build walls and protect your city. To which the king of Ugarit, it's like, yeah, no kidding. Right, thanks. That's not real helpful. Right. But there are others as well that say that the king of Carchemish was on his way with reinforcements. But if they were even sent, they got there too late. Because one of the letters that was just published a decade ago says, it's from the last king of Ugarit, Hammurabi, and he says, I've written to you 2 times, 3 times regarding the enemy. May my Lord know that the enemy forces are stationed in Rashu. That's Ras Ibn Hami, it's the port city. And he says their avant-garde forces have been sent to Ugarit, so send me reinforcements. So this is the king of Ugarit saying that the port city's been overrun by the enemy, and they're on their way to Ugarit. Now, we know they got there, because when the French excavated, they found a meter of destruction at Ugarit. They found hoards that had been buried and never recovered. And in fact, the city was abandoned for between 400 and 600 years afterward. So obviously the enemy got to Ugarit. The problem is we don't know who it is, and I could happily throttle the scribe because he simply says the enemy. Why didn't he say the Sardegna, the Pelesset, the Tjeker, the Ekwesh? But no, he just says the enemy. Obviously, assuming we would know who the enemy is, but we don't know. So we're still back at square one as to who is actually doing this. And then one of the last letters to arrive basically says that the city was sacked. So we know that for a fact. Okay, so you get the idea. Other possible stressors for the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean include earthquakes, which would have affected them over there, but again, not here. There's also evidence for disease. Ramses V died, it looks like, of smallpox in about 1140 BC. And of course, we've got the stories of Shuppi-Luliuma and his family dying 150 years earlier of the plague. So we do know plague was going around. And if you want to look at semi-mythological or legendary, you've got the plague that swept over the Mycenaeans in Book 1 of the Iliad while they're besieging Troy. And of course, with the Exodus, you've got the 10 plagues. So these may all be kind of memories of this. The one thing that I think may have affected Sardinia, though, in addition, is the potential cutting of the trade routes at this time. And so if they were getting the majority of their tin from the area of Afghanistan, Badakhshan, which I think they were, there is some coming from Cornwall, there is some coming from eastern Anatolia, but I think most of it is coming from Afghanistan. If those trade routes were cut and you suddenly couldn't get tin, then you can't make bronze, and then you've got a problem. And that actually used to be one of the leading theories for why the late Bronze Age collapse happened. It's now fallen out of favor in terms of supply chain, but I still think it is an issue. And then that would lead me to the question of how is Sardinia involved in that? If all of the routes coming and bringing, say, Cypriot copper get cut, then what happens to Sardinia at the end of that? So the upshot is, I think, in terms of answering the question of what caused the late Bronze Age collapse, I don't think you can point to any one stressor. I think it is a multitude of them. And in fact, there is now a new word, or at least new to me, called a polycrisis. And this is the way that it can be explained. I still think a perfect storm is a little more understandable to the general public, but polycrisis does kind of have a ring to it. But out of all that, I would say climate change probably was the greatest stressor there. And that what happened is it led to a systems collapse, right? The whole systems collapsed. This is what Colin Renfrew has been talking, or was talking about, since the late 70s. Central administration collapses, central economy collapses, lots of settlement shifts, lots of population decline, and most important, it can take up to a century. And I think that's what we've got with the late Bronze Age. 1177 is a clickbait title. I'll be the first to admit that. Civilization does not collapse in that year. That is simply the year the Sea Peoples attacked. And it does take up to a century, the whole 12th century, in fact, and maybe even earlier in the 13th century. But it takes about 100 years for everything to collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age. And then you've got stories about what collapsed. You've got Homer with the Iliad and the Odyssey. So basically, to come back to what we had said at the beginning, if the Mediterranean really is globalized and they are dependent on each other, then when one fell, I think, depending on who it was, it might have taken the others down as well. Because they are all trading raw metals, raw materials, right? Tin, gold, silver, copper, as well as finished products like the sandals that didn't fit Hammurabi, and wine and olive oil and all of that. So I think depending on who went down, they might have taken the others with us. And in fact, something that's not in the book, any of the books, but we did elsewhere. I was approached by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who said, have you modeled the collapse? And I'm like, no, I don't have access to anything like that. And they said, well, we do. And so I joined forces with them, and we did some computer modeling as to in what order. Sorry about that. Yes, I will. That's my alarm, by the way. You don't all have Indiana Jones on your phone still as your alarm? Am I dating myself? First movie was the best, by the way. So we were modeling it, and what it turned out, after thousands of computer models, there were only two scenarios that would have brought down the whole network. One is if the Hittites and the Egyptians went down at the same time, but we know that didn't happen. The Egyptians do not go down totally, so that scenario didn't work historically. The other scenario was if the Hittites and Ugarit went down nearly simultaneously, which was a surprise to me. I didn't think Ugarit was that important, but they said that was the only other scenario in which it was guaranteed that the entire network would break apart. And so I put that out to you, that seems to have been what happened, that the Hittites went down totally, which we know they did, and Ugarit, as I just said, was abandoned for at least 400 years. The two of them together was enough to break up the whole network, which means it was more fragile and more vulnerable than one might have suspected. Okay, so in my last remaining minutes, let me turn to the aftermath, and that will relate to what we're doing here as well. What I found is that the collapse was pretty messy, but the aftermath is even more messy. Some of the people did well in the aftermath and were able to transform. Others did not do well at all. The Hittites did not do well. Mycenaeans did not do particularly well. But the Neo-Assyrians did okay, and the Phoenicians and the Cypriots did especially well. So that's where the sequel came in after 1177 BC, which I had no intention of writing, but Rob came to me and said, you need to write a sequel. And I said, well, okay, I've got the perfect title. It was going to be called Phoenix from Darkness to Democracy. And he said, wonderful title, no. I'm like, what's it going to be called? He's like, after 1177. I'm like, all right, fine. So I had originally written it chronologically, just like the first one. It went 12th century, 11th, 10th, 9th, and ended in the 8th. And then when I was reading it over, it was literally the penultimate version. I was just reading it over before I sent it to the publisher. And I realized that it didn't work chronologically. Like, chapter 3 was the 10th century. And while reading through it, I'm like, Neo-Assyria did this, Neo-Babylonian did this, Phoenicians did this. I was getting so confused. I was getting what I call literary whiplash, which I think I should probably copyright that, right? Literary whiplash. I'm like, this is not working. So as an experiment, I tried reorganizing it geographically, and I realized that worked. Because that means we have 8 case studies about what to do and what not to do if your society is collapsing. So in the sequel, the first chapter is Canaan and Egypt, then chapter 2 is Assyria, Babylonia, chapter 3, Cyprus and Phoenicia, and so on. The analyses are in chapter 6. So chapter 1 through 5 is basically a history book with some archaeology put in there. And one of the things that I was looking at in particular is something that reviewers have been talking about. Is it really a collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age, or just a transformation? And a couple of them said, again, the title's not just clickbait in the first book, the whole subject is clickbait because it's not a collapse, it's a transformation. So I was trying to answer which one of those was true, or if both of them were. And that's the conclusion I came to, it is both. I want my cake and eat it too. Because what happened is the network, as I just said, the network collapsed, but the individual societies, the 8 societies, each had to then deal with the aftermath. And some did well and transformed, some did so-and-so, adapted or coped, and some didn't do well at all. And I would pull a page from what Norm Yaffe and Patricia McInerney said. If you look at any collapse in too much detail, you lose the forest for the trees. And I show you here what's called the Pink Palace. This is where the Getty Fellows stay with the swimming pool, and everybody can watch you swimming as you go. But look at what I've got with the red that is outlined there. The pool chairs, if you get way in too close, it gets too pixelated and you can't see it. And so they compared a collapse to looking at a low resolution versus a high resolution digital photograph. I think actually a better parallel is an impressionist painting. That if you're from far away, you know what the painting is, but if you get right up close, you get kind of lost in the dabs of paint. And this is true not just for the late Bronze Age collapse, but any collapse, Harappan, Maya, Rome, and all of that. And you can start saying yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. So as I mentioned, I'm going to say it's the network that collapsed, and it's going to take up to 400 years to get the network back into place, and that the individual societies were left to fend for themselves. So it is, yes, both a collapse and a transformation. Now, while I was at the Getty, I had an interesting experience at lunch, which led me to something that helped me wrap up the sequel. I was having lunch at the welcoming banquet. I was sitting next to the curator of Russian art, and as you might imagine, I had absolutely nothing in common with her. Fascinating lady, we had a great conversation. I knew nothing about what she did, but when she finally, during dessert, said to me, "So what are you here for?" And I said, "I'm writing a book on collapse and resilience in the aftermath of the late Bronze Age collapse." And she said, "Oh, you'll want to talk to my husband." I said, why would I want to talk to your husband? She said, because he works for the Rand Corporation and he's a member of the IPCC. I said, oh. And she's like, you've heard of the IPCC? I'm like, yeah, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They got a Nobel Prize back in 2007. They're the ones that publish almost every year on climate change. And so in prepping for the lunch that got set up with him, I went back and looked at all the reports, because it's one of these things where I had been doing research and downloading all the open access without knowing why I was doing it. But then suddenly I'm like, oh, I've already got them all on my computer. And I looked for his name, and he was one of the authors on this report from 2012. It's one of the few where they've looked at climate change and mitigation. And they're looking more at things like Hurricane Katrina and the flooding of New Orleans. But one of the things that hit me is they were talking about an extreme impact event. So when I had lunch with him, I described the late Bronze Age collapse to him, and I said, do you think it would qualify as an extreme impact event? Because their definition is that it could be a single event or the persistence of conditions, like things that lead to drought. And he said, yes, absolutely. I think the late Bronze Age collapse could be considered an extreme impact event. And I said, absolutely wonderful, because you've got 3 definitions of what you can do in the aftermath. One is coping. This is if you're just trying to get to tomorrow, right? You're just trying to make it through the night. Another is adapting, where you're focusing a week out, a month out, and you're actually changing things a little bit. But the big one is transforming, and that's where you say something like, that can't ever happen again. We can't ever allow New Orleans to flood or anything like that. And so that led me to have the temerity to rank the 8 societies as to how well they did in the aftermath of what we're calling the late Bronze Age collapse. And so here I gave them in categories 1 through 5, and I would say that the Phoenicians, from what is today Lebanon, do the absolute best, along with the Cypriots. And in fact, they are what I would call anti-fragile. This was a term that Nassim Nicholas Taleb coined. It's actually the title of one of his books, but it's if you flourish in an age of chaos, if you take advantage of it. And I think the Phoenicians and the Cypriots do this. Phoenicians, obviously, they don't invent the alphabet, but they standardize it. They also standardize the production of purple dye, and then they spread it across the Mediterranean. The Cypriots, as far as we can tell, they're at the forefront of changing over to iron at this point, and they're making bimetallic knives, weapons, tools, but they're also exporting the know-how. So very quickly, all the other countries are able to change to iron as well. So I put Phoenicians and Cypriots as the best. In category 2, I put the Neo-Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians. They almost continue as they had been. They don't lose writing. They still know how to write. They don't lose their king. They don't lose their government. And in fact, the Neo-Assyrians bounce back eventually and take over the whole Near East. So I put them in like category 2. The Egyptians, I put them in category 3. They're resilient, but just barely. This is the 3rd intermediate period in Egypt. And one of the reasons I put them in category 3 is at one point there's at least 3, if not 4, kings in different parts of Egypt, all claiming that they're pharaoh. And to my mind, that's not the way it should be. Though one Egyptologist at NYU said that's not fair. You can't compare a 3rd intermediate period to New Kingdom. And I said, of course I can. That's the whole point. And they're like, no, maybe Egypt works better with 3 pharaohs. And I said, well, maybe it does, but they disappeared from the international scene in that time period. They're not completely out. You've got people like Shoshank, the founder of the 22nd dynasty, but I do think that they should be in category 3. I have gotten other pushback. I gave a lecture in Prague where Egyptology grad students stood up and said, we're number 1 or nothing. And I said, in that case, you're nothing, because you're not in category 1. I did say, I may put you up into category 2. But Egypt is definitely not anti-fragile, so I keep them in number 3. Minoans and Mycenaeans I put in category 4. They're not particularly resilient, but there is continuity. Right? Greece does lose a lot of people. Estimates now, it used to be thought that up to 90% of the population in Greece either died or migrated in the aftermath. Now they've ratcheted it back, and only between 40 and 60% died or migrated. The figures I've seen, something like 600,000 people in the Aegean in the end of the 13th century, and about 330,000 people there in the 11th century. So that's about 40% in there. So I put them in category 4. I do call it a permeable membrane. Things like religion make it through, right? Zeus and Poseidon and all of that. But nobody calls themselves a Wanax anymore after the Bronze Age collapse. And in fact, nobody really called themselves a Mycenaean, if they ever did in the first place. And then in the last category, I put the Hittites, for example. Don't be a Hittite, because they completely disappeared. I think they were probably more vulnerable and fragile than you might expect, but Hittites are not what we need to do. As far as Sardinia, I've been thinking about this the last couple of days. I think I might actually put Sardinia in category 2, because from what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing, and I reserve the right to move you all down to 3, right, or up to 1, is that there is continuity, obviously. There is what it sounds to me like transformation, but it's for sure there's resilience, because they don't disappear, they just change things, right? The nuragica stop being built, but then you get new things, you get these statues coming in. So I'm hoping we can talk about this and see if we were to add Sardinia into this table, where would we put them? So I definitely think it's going to be somewhere 2, 3, somewhere in there. But as you can see, I didn't even put them in writing the book. So if I ever do come up with a revised edition, we'll see where we can work Sardinia in there. But I would like to see where we think they'll be. So if there is a transition, and they didn't collapse, then were they resilient? If so, how were they resilient? Why were they less vulnerable than like the Hittites? And how can we figure that out? So I think there's obviously a lot of work that can be done. And from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of kind of circumstantial evidence that I think one could pull together easily in some sort of edited volume or an article or even a book. And I think we can pull Sardinia into the equation. And so I'm hoping, and I will be taking notes, I'm hoping that we can talk about that at here. So just to wrap up, and I know I'm way over my time, but what lessons can we learn from this? I had the temerity to write up lessons that we might learn from the collapse and the aftermath. They're all common sense. You don't even have to read the sequel to look at these, though I do hope that you would read it, but they're common sense. Have multiple plans in place, have contingency. You know, if your electricity goes out, have a generator. If your generator goes out, what do? You've got mice or gerbils on a treadmill or something, right? But you have contingency plans. You've got to be resilient enough to withstand whatever blows you come. And I do think you need to be fairly self-sufficient, but not isolationist. You know, don't do what we're doing in the States right now. Avoid that. But you do need to be self-sufficient to a certain extent. I think number 4 might be the most important. You have to be inventive and innovative. Tin back then was like oil today, but I think now an actual better analogy would be that it's like rare earths that are used to make computer chips and all that, and we need to get ourselves off of that. I mean, yeah, all kinds of things. But the Iron Age was a period of invention. It's not a dark age. John Papadopoulos has said that the centuries after the collapse, you've got standardization of the alphabet, you've got the turn to iron. That's not a dark age, right? It originally was a dark age because we didn't know anything about it. But now I see it more as an age of invention. And then, of course, number 5, prepare for weather conditions. If you prepare and it doesn't happen, what have you lost? But if extreme weather does happen and you're not prepared, you know, New Orleans is going to get flooded again. And speaking of flooding and all that, number 6, the dependable water resources. I was told on pretty good data that from the State Department that most of the wars for the next century are going to be fought over water. And they're already being fought for that. So I think we have to watch out for that. And of course, the historians here know that you always have to keep the working class happy, or you're going to be in trouble. People tend to lose their heads and such. So again, these are common sense, but I think they are lessons that we can learn, because I think the last question I would ask is, are we facing a similar situation to today, to what they were facing at the end of the late Bronze Age? I think the answer is a resounding yes. Right? We've got climate change, we have famines and droughts, we've got earthquakes, we've got rebellions, we've got disease, we've got migrants and refugees. We have everything that they had, and their globalized network collapsed. So to say that we're too big to fail is just hubristic, right? Every society, every civilization in the history of humankind has collapsed, or at least has transformed to a large enough extent that it's almost unrecognizable in its new iteration. I don't know why we would be any different. So for me, the question is not, are we going to collapse? Because the answer to that is yes. And for me, the question is, when are we going to collapse? For that, I don't have an answer. Could be tomorrow, could be next week, could be 10 years. But we are going to collapse. It's just a matter of what's going to be the trigger point, what's going to send us over there. And when we do collapse, are there going to be any lessons that we can learn from history? Right? I just remember that ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and suddenly we couldn't get toilet paper, right? That was a bit of a problem. So are we going to be Phoenicians, or are we going to be Mycenaeans after the collapse of our current world? And I would include the US and Europe in that, and all the way down into this region. I'm not sure how affected Southeast Asia would be, or China, or anybody, but definitely the G8 of today. And so I will end by quoting John Wooden. I don't know how many of you are familiar with him. He coached UCLA's basketball team to 88 straight wins at one point. That feat will never be replicated. And he used to tell his team, by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. Apparently Ben Franklin said the same thing, but I never met him. So, right. So I think that we need to prepare. And again, just to be on the safe side, because Mark Twain supposedly said history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and I think we are in the middle of a rhyming couplet right now. I see history about to repeat itself. I just don't know when it's going to happen, but it will happen. So I find myself very pessimistic these days, and kind of a Cassandra and a Chicken Little, trying to warn the general audiences that we need to do something about it, and that we need to learn from history, because there are lessons there. So, and with that, I thank you and would answer any questions.
We have margin in the schedule, so if you want to take questions now, you can do it now. Abbiamo spazio nella schedule comunque, perché c'è un bel po' di buffer, quindi se qualcuno vuole fare domande siamo pronti.
Or we can talk over coffee.
O dopo il caffè.
Thank you so much. It was definitely, I learned a lot, and it was very stimulating. One question I have that's I think more broad is about why we talk about collapse in certain cases, or whether we could talk about just again different structures that in some cases might be an improvement. What is, for example, your thought about? I'm fairly sure you've read The Dawn of Everything by Graeber and Wengrow, or vice versa. they basically claim that much of our interpretation of human history is that we see something great, where we see big architecture, wonderful kings, and so on. He claims, they claim, probably life was more miserable for a lot of people. And in the Iron Age, for example, we might be seeing the collapse of structures of power that made actually people happier. So, what's your take about, on this kind of different take?
You have about 3 hours. This is a rather large question. Let me just answer just part of that, right? Because yeah, I would pick up on the life being miserable and all of that. One of the suggestions that's been made is that when, say, the Mycenaean palaces went down, that the Mycenaean peasants, if you will, in Messenia rejoiced. And they're like, great. I mean, this is something that Martin Finney and Eric of Heiberg have said, that the Mycenaean overlords, if you will, the palatial elite, were using and abusing the others to drain the Copaeus Basin, to build the Lion Gate at Mycenae and all of that. And that when the palaces went down, the ordinary people rejoiced. And I would agree with that. I think probably that was exactly the case. The other thing that's been asked is when you have a collapse in a terrible situation, it's terrible for whom? And it was terrible for all the elite, the 1%, but it wasn't necessarily terrible for the other 99%. And if their lives were already miserable, they probably didn't get that much more miserable. In fact, they probably said, oh good, I don't have to pay taxes to that guy in the palace anymore. So it really is all a matter of perspective. And I think Graeber and Wengrove did it's a really interesting book. There's tons there to think about, but that was one of the things that jumped out at me because others have been discussing that as well. Basically, a collapse for whom, and the idea that a collapse for some is actually an opportunity for others. So there's two ways, or more than two ways, of looking at this. But yeah, definitely grounds for further discussion. So thank you.
Yes, we'll be quick. Just to make thank you so much, it was very interesting because just to make the things a bit more complicated, there is maybe it's in the second book, I don't know, but in 1130, King Tiglath-Pileser from Assur, he crosses all North Mesopotamia, northern Iraq, and reaches the Mediterranean. Interesting is to see when he crosses northern Mesopotamia, he doesn't mention any big city, so Emar, it's probably destroyed. So he mentions the Arameans for the first time, but he mentions them not as people living in the cities, but people living in villages, so he uses another term. So, okay, so northern Mesopotamia, we can say situation was not maybe going so well, but by the time he reaches the Mediterranean, he speaks about Byblos, and Byblos appears in his text a flourishing city, and even able to pay a huge tribute to the king. So, of course, the Assyrians exaggerated all the time, we know that. But the point is that I was wondering if Byblos was maybe one of those people who capitalized on other people's crises. Maybe, in Ugarit letters, the enemies are not mentioned. Maybe some of the enemies were also the people from Byblos, who knows. So this is just to make the picture even more complicated. So there are pockets of resilience, as you said, and then other areas of crisis and so on. So I think, the text by Tiglath-Pileser would be interesting to add in the mixture because even if they are, of course, in the propaganda, but this applies also to Ramses III. But I think it would be interesting to add this.
I would agree. And actually, it's already there. It's already there because I would because the Phoenicians, in quotes, didn't call themselves that, right? That's still there. It's Herodotus calling it. They would have said, I'm from Byblos, I'm from Beirut, I'm from Tyre, I'm from Sidon. And so, yes, I see Byblos and the others as surviving. They are anti-fragile. They're up in my first category, right? So I'm not at all surprised that Tiglath-Pileser was able to go over and exact a huge tribute right away. And in fact, they keep doing that throughout the Iron Age. So yes, I think it makes it much more complicated, but also much more interesting. Right, and I think There we've got the archaeology and the text to tell us what's going on there. Again, assuming we can believe the Neo-Assyrians, and it's not all hyperbole. But yes, Byblos, I think, is one of the best examples that we've got of what to do if the network collapses. How do you survive? Right. So, and when I actually was asking Nassim Nicholas Taylor, can I use anti-fragile? It's your phrase, do I have permission? He's, by the way, the guy that popularized the black swan idea, same guy. And he's like, yes, I'm all in favor of it because I'm of Lebanese descent. And to save the Phoenicians, he's like, we're good. Yeah. So, but yeah, so your point is well taken, and I completely agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, Eric, it was great. Thanks so much. Learned so much. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but is there a difference between centralized societies and decentralized societies in terms of their ability to be resilient?
Question, okay, so the difference between centralized and acentralized societies in terms of being resilient. I would say yes, but this is one of the things that needs more study, right? Because it's not completely clear, like, why did the Mycenaeans go down? Why did the Hittites go down? Why didn't the Phoenicians? But yes, if you look at it that way, with the Sidon and Byblos and Tyre and all that, there's no one centralized authority to go down. They're each on their own. Whereas the Mycenaeans, I don't know, you could argue yes and no. The Hittites for sure, centralized, when they go down, they go down. So some people I've seen publications that have suggested that maybe the decentralized is the way to go, and something like the Mycenaeans is a failed experiment that didn't work, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it. But I think this is the type of thing where what I pull together is just the beginning, and I would want to see others now go and explore that, especially from the idea of what makes a society vulnerable and fragile versus resilient. And I think there's a lot to unpack there, but that would be for others to do, but I definitely think it's a question that resonates. I mean, it can be answered, and that may hold then other lessons and suggestions for what we can do when we do collapse.
Grazie dell'occasione, grazie agli organizzatori. Allora, affronto una questione enormemente più grande della mia preparazione, però l'occasione di fornire al professor Cline, a tutti quelli che siete qui, che siamo qui, questo spunto di riflessione per, se le sembrerà il caso, una maggiore comprensione, un'idea da approfondire. Tra le fonti dell'antichità che ha citato, che non c'era la Bibbia, che certamente è da prendere con le molle, però nella Bibbia si parla di Tarshish. Ora, Tarshish figura anche nella stele di Nora. Nella stele di Nora abbiamo la scritta Sardegna e anche la scritta Tarshish. La scritta Sardegna è quella impiegata naturalmente per collegare la Sardegna agli Sardana, molto discussa. Tarshish viene normalmente individuata nella Tarshish iberica, nell'Andalusia. Se però vediamo la Bibbia, nella Bibbia, che magari è stata scritta anche dopo, ma i fatti di cui parla la Bibbia quando nomina Tarshish sono un po' un nucleo storico più antico, e quando si parla in particolare di Giona, che prende l'imbarcazione da Ninive, mi pare, per Tarshish, credo che quello col riferimento al re di cui si parla viene collocato almeno al X secolo avanti Cristo, quindi è possibile, io direi probabile, che la Tarshish biblica sia qualcosa forse di anche più antico, mentre la Tarshish dell'Andalusia ha delle fonti che attestano della sua fondazione, della sua vita e soprattutto della sua capacità metallurgica, che non può avere sviluppato dalla sua fondazione. che sono nettamente posteriori al X secolo a.C., credo che si arrivi all'VIII. E quindi niente, lo spunto che forse quella Tarshish biblica parli di un'altra Tarshish, che abbiamo anche nella storia di Nora. Niente, volevo lanciare questo.
So the question is whether it actually makes reference to the Bible, because the tablet mentions both Sardegna, Sardegna, as well as the Tarshish. So the question is the Tarshish that's mentioned in the tablet, and it has been sometimes referred to Tarshish in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula, actually the same, and he's thinking that maybe the one that's mentioned is actually of a later time, because they talk about metallurgic and other things, so it's definitely not the same one that would have been there. So,
From kind of trying to link this to Terence?
yes.
And the later, okay. Interesting idea. I'm going to have to pass on it because I haven't looked into that.
Can
But
I say something?
you
Sorry,
may.
Yeah.
because this is actually my, Iron Age.
Good.
So the text you mentioned by Jonah in the Bible, it's 7th century. Okay, so we are in the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians are dominating the world. So that's dated both internally and externally. So we are far away from these events. Doesn't really mean anything. The mention to Tartessos, yes, there is the idea that it could be southern Spain. But actually there is Tarso, which is in southwest Turkey and not very well excavated, so it's probably more likely that the Bible is referring to Tarso in Turkey rather than southern Spain. I know that this idea of southern Spain, people love it, but look, in the 7th century, when the Mediterranean and the entire Near East is again a globalized area, for the Bible, the biblical text written in Jerusalem in the 7th century, to mention Tarsus in southern Spain is okay, So we are again in a globalized world in the 7th century. So there is really no special thing that the Bible is mentioning Tartessos, even if we place Tartessos in southern Spain, even if I think it should be in Turkey. But anyway, and yeah, the text is the 7th century, so it doesn't have anything to do with the sea people and so on. This is just a name that probably the biblical writers got when we were in Jerusalem, and so just to.
Thank you for
Sorry,
that. In fact, I will be addressing that in the next book. I'm right now writing the
Okay.
third book in the unintended trilogy, which will go
Chronologically.
Yes, it's going to go from the beginning of the 8th century through the death of Alexander the Great.
Okay.
And it will be called 776 BC, because you still need 2 sevens. And the subtext, the subtitle is The Clashing of Civilizations. So I will be getting into that in the next book, but I haven't yet done that research, so, but thank you. Is that it? Time for coffee?
Domande? Posto?
Questa è la richiesta.
Thank you.
Great, thank you all.